All right, now that we have all of our variations done, we're going to start talking about how we can render inside of ZBrush. So the first thing I'm going to talk to you about is materials. So you can see if you come over to this area, you can go ahead and select from the trough, and you can select from a multitude of different materials that ship with ZBrush. The material that I like to use is the Skin Shade 4, and I might put it on this one and put it down into about a mid kind of gray color. And I might need to actually enable the coloring for this. So if I just go ahead and disable that, I'll hold down Shift and then click on this little brush icon. It's actually going to take off any kind of poly paint information that might be on there, and it'll let me freely kind of change the color to whatever I want. And so like I said, with this shader I like to use a just maybe a slightly almost mid-gray for that right there, and that's a pretty good shader that's got a pretty nice amount of spec on it. But I've made my own shaders over the years, and there's a few of them that I like to use, and some of them are different. Like this one really needs the color to be set to white for that to really kind of work the best that it possibly can to kind of show off the spec and everything else like that. So if you're looking for some different materials, let's go ahead and take a look in a web browser and see some different areas where we can find these materials at. So if you go into your web browser and do a search for ZBrush Material Repository, you should see it's probably going to be this first post here, and you can go right to it. It's on the thread for ZBrush Central, and there's quite a few different pages of people that are just sharing different materials that they've got. So this thread is pretty old and it's been around for quite some time, but you'll have to kind of dig through it and just download a material, and it's pretty simple to load that up inside of ZBrush, and I can show you how you do that. The other area that we can go to is the Pixelogic website as well. So let's go to pixelogic.com, and then we're going to go under support, and you can go down to their download center. So there's a lot of really cool things in here, but what we're going to look at is this matte cap library. So if you go here, you can see that there's different categories for different materials that they've got in here. So they've tried to organize things into these different Z sketch, which is something that's more stylized, effects, shiny, stone, earth tone, skins, and matte. So you might want to just take a look through this, and you can click on any of these and you can actually download them. I like to use anything that has like a more of a traditional kind of clay kind of feel to it. So you know, I don't know, just by looking at this page here, I'd probably try out this one. I do like the red Chavant kind of look as well for clay. So those are two different areas that you can get your materials, and like I said, once you download those, it's pretty easy to import them in. So you can just go to the material tab right up in here, and you can say load, and then you can just navigate to wherever that material sits. So I've built a folder structure for myself where I keep all the different materials that I use and that I've collected over the years. So if I go to Pixelogic right here like this and go to ZBrush Tools, I've made a folder for myself called Materials. I keep all the materials that I've made in my own special folder like this, and then all these other materials are different materials that I've downloaded and things like that. The cool thing is that you can go through Lightbox, so if you hit the comma key, you can actually go into Lightbox, and then you can go to Materials. And there's with the program, there's just these two materials here. I can just navigate up to where that ZBrush folder is of mine that I called ZBrush Tools, and I'll go in there and I'll go to Materials right here, and then I can actually find like mine. You can see that it's going to give you a preview, so here's a lot of different previews of all these different materials that I've found and downloaded and things like that. And so here's my folder that I've got for the different materials that I've made, and it's just a lot of different trial and error. So the building of the materials is a bit out of the scope for what we're taking a look at in this series, but the good news is, if you don't really want to mess with this, there's so many people that have been generous and kind of shared their work that you don't really have to worry about that so much. You could just load them up and use them. So again, I'm trying to find something that's kind of like this mid gray kind of color. And once we got a material set up, we're going to be using best possible render. So you can see here's the button here for it. And I'm going to go to the render tab, and I'm just going to go click this and click and drag and dock it over here into this section. And then we'll start talking a little bit about some of these different render properties. So you can see for what I'm doing, I'm just turning on shadows and ambient occlusion. Okay, I'm not getting too crazy with stuff with subsurface scattering and everything else like that. Like I said, I think that's a bit out of the scope for what it is that we're looking at in this section. I just want to get a really nice clean gray render outside of ZBrush that's going to be pulled into Photoshop, and then I could paint on the top of that, or just do some things in Photoshop to maybe enhance it just a little bit and end up with a really nice piece for a concept piece that would hang on the wall, and the art director could come by and take a look at this thing. So let's take a look at shadows. So if you turn on shadows and ambient occlusion, we're going to open up the BPR shadow area, and you'll have to evaluate these different values against what you might have as a default. So I like to have this F strength, which is the floor strength. I think you can hold down control and hover your cursor over any of these, and you can get a better idea of what it is that you're taking a look here. Floor strength is if you have a floor on and you have your light, it's going to render a shadow on the floor, and then this is the strength of the shadow that's on the floor. So you also have a global strength for all your shadows within the scene. So I have mine set to 0.55. I didn't want the shadows to like overpower things just because I want to see most of the model. I do want to have a nice look for shadows, but I don't want this to be so strong. So raise for the light, I think I have this at right around 16, and an angle of 2. So if you see with the default values, I think this angle is set fairly high. And basically what that does is it produces this effect that like there's multiple lights in the scene casting shadows, and I don't really like that. I like to have one strong directional light casting the shadows. So if I put this angle down to something really small, like 1 or 2, and then kick up these rays that are being kicked out for the shadows, this seems to work pretty good for me. Also, the resolution of this, I have mine at 2048. I'm rendering at the document size of 1920 by 1080, so this resolution seems to work fairly well. Now if you start to kick up this number with the width and the height inside of ZBrush and you're rendering with this, you might find that this resolution is too low, and if you do renders and you see that your shadows are kind of pixelated or not so high res, you can bump up this number here. This V depth, the best way I think I can kind of describe that is to say that this is kind of a contrast for the shadow that it kicks out. So I'll just go ahead and hit Shift R to do this best possible render, and then we can take a look real quick at what it kicks out. So if you go to this BPR render passes, you can hover your cursor over this thing and you can see what's going on with these things. So I know this isn't the best preview, but all you have to do to get these maps out of here is just click on it and it'll take you to some place where you can actually export those, and the best place to look at that is inside of Photoshop. But you can get a little preview like this. So if you put that V depth to 0 and did a render, and then you kind of took a look at what was going on here, you can see it builds higher amounts of contrast. If that number is set to 0, not like a -4, then to me the shadows kind of get kind of muddy and kind of put a lot of dark shading on the entire model, and I'm not too thrilled with that. So that's why I'm taking the BPR shadow V depth and knocking that down to a -4. Alright, so let's move on to BPR AO, and I leave the strength all the way to 1 on floor strength, and the global strength set that to 1. I've got 32 rays, and the resolution is set to 2048, just like what we did with the shadow. Angle is set to 180. And I can't remember if this is something that's default or not. I thought it might have been 360, but that's what I've got it set for this right now. And the V depth on this, I'm actually leaving this thing alone because I don't want to blow out the AO pass. I would want to get as much information from that as possible. I just noticed that if we go to the render passes and kind of take a look at the AO, it's not very heavy at all. Okay, so I showed you this here where we've got these different passes that get rendered out. So we can go ahead and take this. The things that I really care about is this shaded, which gives the overall shaded version of this. So we could kick that out. That's a possibility. And then also this mask, and if you want to do special effects and things like that, you can kick out depth and then shadow and then the AO separately, and then you could kind of comp all those things together inside of Photoshop if you want. They've even got a thing for the floor, rendering out the floor on here. Now if you want to get a flattened version of the entire image, you can go ahead and just go to Document, and we can say Export like this, and then just go ahead and give it a name. I'm going to actually make a folder right here like this, and I'm going to call this Design 1 like this, and then I'm going to just throw everything in there. Now I've already kicked out these maps before, so I'm just going to throw them in there real quick. And I was going to use this folder structure and keep the same naming convention that ZBrush gives me. So this thing is just going to call this a ZBrush document. I can go ahead and save that. And I'm just going to replace what I have there. And then I can go ahead and kick out these individual pieces over here from this render. So I just click on this and then hit save. And I'm going to go through each one of these, the depth, the shadow, the AO, and definitely for me the mask is something really important, and could use the floor too. So I'll just kick everything out like that, and then now we'll just hop on over to Photoshop. So here we are inside of Photoshop, and I'm just going to go ahead and open up those documents. So I have to navigate to where they sit. So I'm going to go ahead and go to this where I went and saved the ZBrush renders and this design one, and I'll go ahead and load up all the different maps that ZBrush allowed me to kick out. So again, let's take a look first at this ZBrush document, and then this is basically exactly what we saw inside of ZBrush whenever we rendered. So I'm going to hit Control plus or minus to zoom in and out, and if I want to change the whole window I can hit Control and Alt and minus and plus and zoom in and out on that. And so here's my image like this. Now what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be taking all these different designs and I'm going to be putting them all on one page. So I need to get this guy separated out from his background. So I can just double click on the background and I can call this design, let's see, maybe variation first. Variation 4, and then this will be design 1 for this, like that. And I'll hit Control and Alt and make this window a little bit smaller so I can make sure that I'm getting my mask in here. So here was the shaded version from ZBrush, and then we've got our shadow that you can take a look at that's nice and high res, the BPR render that we kicked out, and here's our mask. So I'll hit Control A to do a select all, and then do a Control C to copy, and then now I can make a new layer, a layer mask on here. So I'll just click that, and let me go ahead and hit Alt and click in here, and then I'll hit Control V to paste that in there. So I just made the layer mask, and then hit Alt on this little icon here to let me preview the mask, and then I can just paste that mask in there. Now to go back to the regular mode, I just hold down Alt and click in here, and you can see now this character has been separated from his background. Let's zoom in really close here. I just wanted to check and make sure nothing crazy was going on here. I did notice when I was kicking out some of these masks that the levels were not all the way 100% on it. So if I hit Control L and take a look at this, I can take the white point on here and drag it down just a little bit, you can see it was introducing just a little bit of transparency. So I can drag this over to the left just a little bit like this, past this little line, and now I'm set to go. Alright, so I could keep this mask, that's a possibility. The other thing I could do is, just to get rid of it, I can hold it, click and drag it down to the trash icon, and it's going to ask me, do I want to apply this? And yes, I do. And then now once that's done, I can go ahead and save this out as a different version. So I can hit Control Shift S to do a save, and then maybe I just put like a version 2 or something like this after this. So this is going to help me when I go to build my larger document for all the different designs that I'm going to have on here. So again, I don't really need the mask anymore, so I can close that down. We've got our BPR render. Like I said, if you wanted to actually use these things, and you could use the shadow as a multiply layer inside of here for the blend mode over the top of something, that's a possibility as well. And we've got shaded, and we've got the floor that gives you basically depth information that you could select back here like this. So what you could do with something like that is you could pull this thing over, just put it on here like this. So I always put it on the move tool, held down Shift, and drug this thing over like that. So I'll just go ahead and take this floor, and I can actually use this as a mask. So I can hit Control A, I'll copy it, and I can turn this off. And if I make a new solid color, it'll give me a mask that I can start playing with. So I can click right in here, and I can hit Control V to paste that in here. Actually, I need to hit Alt and click on here, and then hit Control V, and then I can hit Alt on this icon again, and you can see that we've got this over the top of this. Now, I want this underneath of my illustration thing that we've got going on here. The other thing I can do is add a new solid color layer. I'll just make this black, and I can put this underneath the floor that you see here. And I'm not too fond of how this ends out here at the back. So I could actually just take my gradient tool, so I just tap G, and I've got it on this one that goes from color to transparency. So you can make sure that you're on this one here, like that. And I'm going to do a linear gradient, and then I'm going into this mask. I'm actually filling with black, so I can click and drag down. If I hold down Shift, I can constrain that to a straight point. You can see I can kind of feather that out a bit more now. And I can close this thing up. Now at that point, I'm going to want to have some stuff in here, which is the AO. So I can drag this thing over like this, and we can set this to be multiplied. So one thing, there's some weirdness going on. It's this document is not at the same bit rate and everything else as this other document. So I got to change that to grayscale under mode, and then I'll go here and I'll do RGB color like this, and then now I can drag it over and everything should work okay for me. Okay, so there's just a little bit of darkness under here, and I can set this thing to a multiply layer for the AO. And if you don't see it, you could double this thing up like that. I can hit Control E to merge those down. And then now if I call this AO like this and call this floor, you can see I can turn that thing on and off and just get a little bit of that contact shadow there from the AO. So I could save that. I did close down the shadow pass, and if I open that thing up, I think this is going to be the same issue as the AO, so we have to go to image mode and then go to grayscale and then change that to RGB, and then just drag that over. I'll hold down Shift and drag it over, and it'll snap directly into the right spot because it's the same size. And so I'll drag this down under the AO, and I'll call this shadow like that, and I'll set this to multiply. And so now I get this ground shadow, and we could just change the opacity on that to be whatever you want at that point. And since we've got this on a solid color, we could play around with changing whatever that color is of the floor, and then the background separate, so we can always go back in and kind of change that if you wanted to do that. And as I make this thing a little bit lighter, it's coming through that you can see what's going on with this floor, and there's still a line on here, so I'll also have to go back to that gradient tool and then just make sure that the gradient is taking care of this entire thing right here with that mask. Now, what we could do with the depth, which is kind of interesting, is if we took a version of this entire thing that we've got here and we blurred it, so we'll make a copy of everything. We'll hit Control A to select everything, and I'll do Control Shift C to do a copy merged, and you can find all this stuff up here under Edit, Copy Merge, like that. And then I'll just paste it on the top. I'll hit Control V, and it'll make this new layer. Looks exactly the same as it did before. It's just everything's been flattened down to this one layer, and I'll call this Blur, like that. And let's just go ahead and go to Filter, and then go to Blur, and then we'll do a Gaussian blur, like this. And I think that's pretty good. So we could pump it up a little bit more. Let's just leave it at 4. We'll hit OK for that. Now I want to use this depth as a means to kind of say whatever's further away from the camera, I want that to be blurry. So you can see what's closer to the camera is rendered in white, and what is farther away is rendered in black. So we'll select this whole thing. We'll Control A to select all. We'll copy it, Control C, and then we're going to our other document here, and then let's just make a mask for this. So with that layer selected, click the little mask icon, hold down Alt, click on this icon here, and that'll let us go into the mask, and we hit Control V to paste the mask in here. Alt, click again to go back, and then now basically what we've got is the opposite. Whatever's closest to the camera is blurry, and then you can see the arms and the tail are in focus. So just to get the inverse of that, we just select this mask, hit Control I to do an inverse, and then now you can see we've got that depth kind of going on. The other thing we can do after we've got this thing set up is we can select it, this mask, and hit Control L to bring up levels, and you could play around with the different values on here to see like how much that kind of bleeds in and at what point. So I'm just going to hit cancel on that because I don't really want to mess around with things too much on there. The other cool thing about this is after this has been set up, because we've got this separated from the background, this part right here, which is the render, we can go ahead and go to blending options, and we can do some stuff with this where if we wanted to turn on a stroke, we could put a stroke and give it a little bit of an outline to this thing right here, like this. And I need to make sure that this is actually on top if I want to do that. So the reason I wasn't seeing that is we got this whole layer on top that's got the this blur going on. So if I put this on top and go to blending options, now we can go to that stroke and change the size of that thing to like 2 or 3. And you could change it to colors, or you can make it white if you want, something like that. But I just kind of wanted this thing to kind of pop off the page a little bit more. So if I took that stroke and stroked the outer edge just with maybe a darker color, we could do that. And if you want to do an outer glow, you could use this as a stroke as well, but we could just put this on normal. I'll put this color to white, opacity set to 100%, and we can do the spread and size. Spread I can turn up, and that makes it really nice and crisp. And then the size you can drop down like that. So that's how you can get like kind of a double stroke effect or whatever. And then you could play around the opacity too if it's just too much. Like you just might want it to barely pop that thing out. But so that's a possibility for you. And if you don't like it, you can just go ahead and turn the whole thing off, like that. We've also got a drop shadow, but we've got our shadow information from ZBrush that we've already got anyways. So that's one way to just set up one of the renders, right? So while we're building this thing, what we could be doing is, if I take this and throw everything into a layer group. So if I select all the things that I want to contain, so let's say the AO, let's just say the shadow AO, the blur, and this, and I hit Control G, I can make a new group for this, and I can call this, let's see, variation. I'm going to go ahead and rename this, double click it, and call this variation 4, and this will be design 1, something like that. Just give yourself some kind of naming convention so you know kind of what's going on with this thing. And then you could give yourself a layer mask on that entire group. And so if you wanted to kick this thing out, you could fill this with black in here, which is going to knock out the inner part. So I'll deselect on that, and then what we want is the inverse of that. So you select your mask and hit Control I, and you can see we've got the inverse of that. So now if you wanted to contain that stroke with everything, you would have to maybe hold down Control and select this, and then you could do something like stroke. You can see we need to let more white come in on this mask, so we'll just go edit stroke, change the color to white, and we'll do like 2 pixels. Let's just do 3, and we'll do center, so it strokes along the center of this path like that, and still doesn't look like it's enough. If we want to hide the mask, we can hit Control H just to see what's going on. So we'll go edit stroke, let's try something like 6, and you can see now it's starting to let that thing kind of come through. After I close this thing up and we turn off the background, you can see now we've got something that we could just take the entire group and move it together as a whole, right? So then if we're going to paste this into another document, like if we hit Control N to make a new document, we could just take that entire group and shift it over. So I'm just going to hold down Shift and then drag it in with the Move tool on that group. Because I'm pasting into a document that's the same size, it's just going to snap in the center there. So now here's my guy in a new document, right? And so after we get done, we'll have multiple versions of this thing, and they'll just have to be spaced out correctly so there's enough room around everybody, something like this. And then I've got 4 different designs, and I'm going to do 3 different variations for each one. So I think this is a pretty good kind of starting point for this. Now whenever the final document is done, I want this to be on 11 by 17 with a pretty high print quality rate, so something that's right around 300 dpi or so. And then so the final document will have 3 up here on the top left, and then 3 on the top right, 3 on the bottom left, and 3 on the bottom right, and that'll give me 12 different designs on here. So I'll have all 4 different variations on a Photoshop page, and I'll have everything laid out. Have to start building some lettering and things like that, so people know, when they look at this, which design we're talking about and which one is going to be picked by everybody. And so before I conclude on this particular area, there's one last thing that I want to make sure that you know about and that you're practicing, and that's using cameras inside of ZBrush to make sure you're saving off whatever that view is, so you can always get back to it. So if you go into our document and open up at the very bottom this Zap Link Properties, you can go ahead and store a camera view per one of these little tabs that you see here. So if you do a front, it's going to store a back for you. If you do a right, it's going to automatically store a left with this as well. And if you use these customs, you can see I've got a custom view for this one here and this one here, so they're just slightly a little bit different. The custom lets you do whatever you want with it. Now if you want to use a front and it auto generates like the back and you don't like the back, you can say clear to, and you can clear this back thing that's saved. You can see a camera that's saved is highlighted in this orange color, and so you can say clear to and clear the back off of that, and then at that point you're free to manipulate this thing. Let me go ahead and see here. So there is some kind of bug with the front camera sometimes where it flips or whatever, which is pretty annoying, but not too big of a deal. So if I want to store this back one, I can go ahead and store that, and now you can see I've got a back and then I've got a front, which needs to be flipped here like this, and so I guess this will be a good way to show you this anyways. So I'll say clear to front, and after it's cleared I can select it again and just click it, and so then now I've got this front camera and this back camera, and I got my custom 1 and 2, and if I want I can just save these. So you can save the views, and it's going to save it as a little tiny kind of file, and the next time you come into a session you can just come down here and say load views, and then all your cameras will be available for you again. So just make sure, I like to save using projects, so if I go to file and then say save as, the cameras don't save with ZBrush currently as 4R6, so that's just something to keep in mind. So you definitely want to make sure you're setting up some cameras for yourself so you can always get back to that view and be rendering for all the different designs that you're doing.